Welcome back to Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing. If you're responsible for training the next generation of lab professionals or looking to level up your own expertise, you're in the right place. My name is Jessica Martin, and I'm a lab training professional with a background in chemical education research and community empowerment. I'm here to dive with you into the real-world strategies, expert insights, and game-changing discussions that will help us develop lab professionals who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing. Today, I am ruminating on the safety professional's role in safety. And you might be thinking, what on earth are you talking about? The safety professional's role is safety. But is it? The safety professional is brought in to, in some way, make safety happen in an organization. However, this role doesn't make sense without defining the work that actually happens in an organization. And in order for work to happen safely, isn't it actually the ones doing the work who need to do safety in the organization? So I come back to my original question, what is the safety professional's role in safety? Rae Provan published a paper back in 2019 called Safety Work versus the Safety of Work, linked in the show notes. And like me, they are trying to shove the word safety into as many places as possible. Just kidding. They already won. They published this paper in the journal Safety Science, then proceeded to use the word safety 483 times in a 7-page paper. Now, despite this lack of creative wordplay, they make some really interesting points when it comes to a safety professional's role in safety. First, some definitions. They explain that the safety of work is understood as operational safety, which relates to the likelihood and consequences of accidents arising from the way operational work is performed. So you can think of the safety of work as what the people do who are doing the work of an organization. We can use wet labs in academic institutions to help with the understanding of these terms. The safety of work is what researchers in the lab are doing when they are in their labs performing experiments. Safety work, on the other hand, splits into 4 types according to Rae Provan's model presented in this paper: demonstrated safety, social safety, administrative safety, and physical safety. They assert that it is unhelpful to think of safety work as distractions from purportedly real safety, but instead it is important to understand how the different aspects of safety are interrelated. Reading through Rae Provan's arguments around their model for safety work got me thinking about another paper. Huising published To Hive or to Hold, Producing Professional Authority Through Scut Work back in 2014, also linked in the show notes. This is one of the papers that came out of her ethnographic work studying a large R1 university's reorganization of wet lab safety after an EPA inspection. In it, she describes following 2 different groups responsible for different aspects of lab safety. These 2 groups had distinctively different ways that they interacted with lab members that had developed over decades that were a result of how they performed their work. I'm going to refer to them as yes scut and no scut, which has you all wondering, what is scut work? A definition straight from their paper: scut work is work that does not draw on or display professional expertise and requires additional interaction with clients in which the professional is observed doing work that is physically, socially, or morally difficult or dirty work. In the context of the lab environment, the yes scut group would perform their safety functions in part by coming into the lab spaces on a regular basis, i.e. more than once per year, and performing work of their own inside of the space that supports the safety prerogatives for which they are responsible. The no-scut group typically does not perform this work, instead hiving off this work to contractors. As a result, they only came into lab spaces once per year, and then only to perform inspections, not any actual hands-on scut work. FYI, I'm going to jump back and forth between these 2 papers for the rest of this episode to explain how I see the observations that Huising was making in academic environments fits into the model that Rae Provan have proposed. Rae Provan describe demonstrated safety as structural work oriented towards stakeholders outside of the organization, showing that the organization is meeting its safety obligations. Now, Huising explains that both the yes scut and no scut groups maintained committees in the university that were responsible for generating the paperwork necessary to show external stakeholders that safety was occurring in their specific realms. And they pursued this work in pretty much the same way. Rae and Provan describe social safety as the work designed to maintain safety as a value, and the organization's belief in itself as a champion of safety. Now, the very existence of the yes scut and no scut groups, as well as the work they were each expected to perform, were designed to fulfill this aspect of safety work. I would argue that it was on administrative safety that the two groups diverged. Rae and Provan define administrative safety as structural work, oriented inwards, providing a mechanism for safety concerns to influence operational work. Huising writes about differences in knowledge that the two groups collected as a result of their position on scut work. She explains that the no-scut group was not exposed to daily life in the labs, and as a result did not include the daily, situated, pragmatic aspects of laboratory work in their role. They only observed labs briefly, once per year during formal inspections. By contrast, the members of the yes scut group were seeing what was happening in the labs in real time, weekly. The knowledge that they collected was used to work with researchers on compliance on a regular basis. They saw how their policies and procedures were understood and implemented in labs. They could also more readily identify which infractions were an anomaly versus representing established work patterns. By being a regular presence in the labs, they had created a more continuous mechanism to identify safety concerns. Additionally, through their scut work, this group created exchange-oriented, mutually beneficial relationships with lab members. By doing things like cleaning up minor spills, helping address leaking sinks, and other issues in labs, instead of merely noting it formally on an annual inspection, the yes scut group created relationships through which they could influence operational work going on in labs. When I read this, it reminded me of several very influential moments for me when I was a graduate student researcher. One experience that makes me laugh a bit to this day was when one of the chemical safety specialists at my institution was in my building doing a training in a lecture hall. I chatted with him afterwards about a system that we had put in place in our lab to distill solvents for reuse. I had a few questions about the system that I wanted to ask him to make sure that we wouldn't be told to take it apart in an inspection later. We walked to my lab. My lab was actually 3 lab spaces next to each other with 3 separate doors. The distillation system I was asking him to look at was in the first lab space as we approached. However, as we were walking up, he reached in his pocket for his safety glasses to put on before entering the space, then realized that he hadn't brought them as he hadn't been expecting to go into any lab spaces. He asked me if he could borrow a pair from me. I was somewhat early on in my graduate research career, and I did not have the best record of donning my safety glasses. Don't worry, I have since very much improved this practice. In the moment, I felt a little embarrassed that he thought of eye protection and I didn't. However, I was able to save face since my safety glasses were sitting on my desk that was behind the second door to my lab. So I casually passed the first door as if I had completely intended upon going straight to the second door to don my safety glasses. Obviously, right? Then I was able to hand him a pair to borrow. It is important to realize that in this case, I was asking him to come to my lab to check out the safety of something. At this point, he had done good work in establishing a relationship with me that made this moment embarrassing for me. In all honesty, if he was just some random safety guy that I saw once a year during an annoying inspection, I would not have felt the same level of embarrassment. Reflecting on that now, I would say that the administrative safety work that brought him and other chemical safety specialists into labs more regularly had led to the opportunity for that professional relationship to develop, hence making them more influential, even when they didn't know it. Now back to the concept of safety work. Rae and Provan define physical safety as the work that directly transforms the work environment in the interest of safety. Huising describes how the no-scut group would reprimand groups for disposal practices in their labs while not providing any specific support for how to perform the disposal correctly. And since they hived off the actual disposal work to a contractor, they weren't a regular part of that work themselves, so they weren't having regular and specific conversations about disposal with members of the labs. With the Yes Scut group, the author observed them helping to change a filter for a chemical fume hood, which technically wasn't even a part of their job, but meant that the hood could be safely operated at a much sooner date. Now, my experience with such a moment while in graduate school speaks to the outsized influence of a vendor that scut work had been hived off to. In this case, the outside vendor picked up filled waste containers from our labs. At the time, I had not realized he was from an outside company. I thought that he worked for the EH&S department. The form I filled out to have waste collected was part of our internal system and did not indicate to me that an outside vendor was getting that information and responding to it. In any case, one day he was there to pick up waste, and he asked me a question. He pointed at one of my hoods and asked, "So what's going on there?" So what was he pointing to? We did polymer chemistry in our lab. The monomers we used were preserved with an inhibition chemical that had to be removed before we could use the monomers in reactions. We removed this chemical with a very small column that was made of silica poured into a disposable glass pipette. When I was originally trained on this process, the graduate student training me said that someone from EH&S had told them that if we flipped the glass pipettes upside down and left them in containers, the silica would dry out and drop out of the glass pipette. Then we could dispose of the silica in the solid waste and dispose of the glass pipette in the clean broken glass. Now the problem with this? This drying and falling out never occurred. As a result, we had loads of these silica-filled glass pipettes in containers all over the lab, including taking up ridiculous amounts of space inside of our hoods. Also, there were way too many of these glass pipettes inside of the containers themselves, so they were sticking up in all sorts of haphazard ways. I was in my first year of grad school, and I had no idea who to ask to figure out what to do about this mess that was years in the making, especially since the directions had apparently come from EH&S. And no one else in my lab seemed concerned about it. When this hazardous waste vendor asked me, "So what's going on there?" I gave him the explanation that I got. He didn't laugh at me, which I appreciated. Instead, he explained that the separation was unnecessary. I could simply put the whole thing into solid waste, write that broken glass was included in the solid waste, and it would be picked up. And wow, was I grateful for this bit of information. I spent the next hour going through the lab and dumping all of these stupid pipettes into the solid waste container. And every time I saw him after that, I had another question for him. After a few months of this, I mentioned how much I appreciated this guy to one of our chemical safety specialists. And it was then that I discovered that this guy didn't even work for my university. Now, I can't account for how PIs reacted to our safety professionals or our hazardous waste vendors, but as a lost graduate student just trying to figure it all out, I was so grateful for their presence in the labs and total willingness to help me out. And instead of having issues mentioned once a year on a formal inspection, it was great to have someone with a different perspective walk into my lab and ask me to explain what was going on. Sometimes it was me sheepishly admitting that I knew that I wasn't supposed to be leaving something a certain way. But a lot of the time, it was either a problem I didn't know how to solve or something that I didn't even realize was a problem. By offering me actual help, I was able to resolve a lot of problems around the lab. And everything they did that helped me out came back to them tenfold easily. By helping me learn how to do things right, our lab inspections came back cleaner with each passing year. Of course, not all contractors are willing to engage with lab members this much when they are there to perform their duties. I have an example of this from my own experience as well. At one point, my department introduced an outside vendor to start checking our eye wash stations. There was no announcement to the graduate students that this was happening. So one day, I hear someone enter my lab from a different space, then I hear the eye wash station gushing water. I walked over to see two people who I didn't know messing with safety equipment in my lab space. I approached and said, "Hi, can I help you?" They responded with, "No thanks," and continued with their work, essentially ignoring me. I sent out a bunch of emails to other lab members, my PI, and the chair of my department to report that this was going on. That is when I was informed by the chair of my department that this was initiated at the department level. I really hated that experience. On the one hand, I was being told that I had a responsibility for the security of my lab space. On the other hand, no one felt the need to inform any of us that new people were being given access to those same lab spaces. And the contractors themselves felt no need or compulsion to introduce or explain themselves to folks in the labs. Upon reflection now, I would say that this undermined any responsibility or ownership I felt about our lab space as a researcher. I definitely didn't feel invited to ask questions of the contractors themselves, and all this created distance between me as a researcher and the safety functions of the university. Another aspect of Huising's paper that got me thinking was about perceived professional stature and the concept of relational authority. The No Scut group had worked hard to create knowledge dependencies with the labs. They even dressed more nicely than the Yes Scut group, since they had no expectation of doing any dirty work. Members of the No Scut group explained to the author that they pushed this further by using scientific knowledge to connect with PIs in order to build rapport and a peer-to-peer relationship. However, the author found that in listening to the conversations in the lab, neither the PIs nor the lab members viewed the No Scut group as peers, and went to some lengths to undermine and in some cases eliminate their professional authority. By contrast, the Yes Scut group had no expectation of a peer-to-peer relationship. They dressed down for work given the dirty work they expected to do inside of the labs. And since they spent so much time getting familiar with the members of the labs, not just the PIs, there was a comfort level that allowed for a bit more frank discussion. This had its downside. They described being well aware that upset PIs could simply ignore them, but it also allowed them to create practical operational dependencies that they could use to get their jobs done. And they weren't just looking to build relationships with the PIs. They were building these relationships with all members of the lab groups. Achieving compliance was a regular, ongoing discussion that the Yes Scut group could productively engage because they were doing work that allowed for credible empathy with the researchers. While the Yes Scut group may have looked as if they were lower in the hierarchy than the No Scut group, they were far more capable of achieving their prerogatives with the researchers through relational authority. In conclusion, Huising writes, I found that scut work facilitates the production of relational authority, the capacity to elicit voluntary compliance from clients. When professionals do scut work, they interact with clients more often and in a different way. As they do menial work in the service of the client, they expand the basis of their relationship and learn more about the clients. This got me thinking about what it means to be professionally dressed. Shouldn't it mean that you are dressed for the requirements of your profession? And yet somehow it doesn't. It often refers to being dressed in suits, ties, blouses, slacks, conservative skirts, high heels, items that typically shouldn't be worn inside of a lab. Now, I was talking to a colleague about struggling over how to dress for an interview a while ago. The interview was for a hands-on safety position. On the one hand, I was inclined to dress up. This would have included high heels, a mid-calf skirt, a blouse with a lowish hanging front, all made out of materials that are, well, flammable. On the other hand, none of this stuff should be worn inside of a lab, especially if you were there to help clean up a chemical spill. So perhaps I should dress the way that I would expect to dress for the actual job to prove that I know how to do that. This also got me thinking about a professor I had for one laboratory-based class. She dressed in skirts, high heels, and nylon stockings every day. I thought it was a very poor example of professionalism in a lab, and contradicted the instructions that we as students got for how to dress inside of lab spaces. And it definitely lowered my impression of her. But no one could say that she wasn't professionally dressed. I also remember some of my initial impressions of some chemical safety specialists I have met at their work sites. In particular, I have found two types of men. One type is wearing slacks, a button-down shirt, a tie, often a blazer, and fancy dress shoes. They look like they probably have some sort of executive or administrative role, or perhaps are aiming for one. Then there is the second type. They are wearing sensible shoes for walking around in all day, practical trousers, maybe a collared shirt, no tie, no blazer. They look like they are ready for a practical day of work in the labs ahead. Admittedly, the first type of man does look like he probably makes more money and has more administrative authority. But as a researcher, I also thought, wow, I don't want this man anywhere near my lab. He looks flammable. Or at least he looks like someone who would be upset about his clothing if something got splashed on him. In terms of relational authority with a lab member, the man who was dressed in a more practical way struck me as the one who likely knew what he was doing and would be helpful if I asked him specific questions about safety stuff in my lab. By the way, I ended up dressing fancy for the interview. But once I saw the interview was going reasonably well, I slipped in some jokes about how unusual it was for me to be dressed this way and how flammable I was, just to make sure they knew that I knew that they knew that I knew. Well, I know how to dress myself to work in a lab. So I'm curious to hear how you all frame the work of a safety professional, whether you are a safety professional yourself or whether you work in a role that has you engaging with safety professionals. Is it common for safety professionals to be in the labs for more than just an annual inspection? How often do safety professionals and researchers interact at your institution? And who is doing scut work at your institution? Professional employees or contractors or someone else? Finally, if you are inspired to read either the Rae Provan paper or the Huising paper that I shared in this episode and linked in the show notes, I'm very curious to see what stands out for you. Let me know by either emailing me at skilledsafeandtrailblazing@gmail.com, commenting in our LinkedIn community linked in the show notes, or by leaving a comment on this episode. Thank you for all you do to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
Skilled, safe, and trailblazing is meant for those working in labs or training others to do so. The information shared here is a starting point, not a complete guide or legal standard. We've done our best to use reliable sources, but we make no guarantees about accuracy or completeness. Always follow local, state, and federal laws and consult legal or safety experts if you have questions.